my book is pretty much like all action, no vibes, or all vibes. I can't really tell.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Corrine from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Keep It Fictional, a book podcast for book lovers by book lovers from the Port Moody Public Library. I'm your host today, Emma, and I am joined by my book friends Corrine, Sadie, and Virginia. Now, this week, we continue the series of talking about our obsessions. We've discussed cults, we've discussed vampires, and we've discussed the banana pants of it all. And today we're talking about one of my personal obsessions. Our listeners have probably already picked up on some of the things that I love in my books and media. I love queer stories, I love mythology and magical realism, I love manga, and as Corrine put it, I love the warrior bonds of men. So one of my obsessions that hasn't really come up on the pod yet, though, but is really prevalent in the TV shows and the video games and other media that I enjoy is warrior women. They can be gunslingers, they can be cowgirls, they can be medieval knights wielding giant broadswords, and they can even be vampire slayers. But they must be warriors. I've been looking forward to this topic for weeks now, and I can't wait to see all of the types of hardcore female fighters that my book friends have brought to share with us today. So first, I think we're going to begin with Sadie.
Everybody knows the tale of the mighty sunbirds, how they rose into the sky, scorching the earth and causing unthinkable suffering for the mortals who lived there. Droughts, charred soil where nothing would grow. Many of the tales say that the gods favored the sunbirds and so did nothing to stop them. Or maybe, unaffected as they were up in the heavens, they just did not care to try. And so the suffering continued. But then, a fearless warrior, a mortal named Ho Yi, took up an enchanted bow of ice and shot 9 arrows up into the sky. He slew 9 of the sunbirds with his arrows, leaving just one to light the sky. In exchange for his bravery, the celestial emperor gifted Ho Yi with the elixir of immortality. The tale of the moon goddess is also well known, though maybe not quite as accurately. Some say that she betrayed her husband, stealing his elixir of immortality to become a goddess herself. Others say that she was simply trying to protect the elixir from thieves, and so she drank it herself, becoming a goddess in the process. The true story, the one that Qin Ying doesn't hear until she is almost an adult herself, is much, much more heartbreaking. How Chang'e took the elixir to save not her own life, but the life of her unborn daughter. How she was forced to betray her husband, a man who she still loves with all her heart, so that her baby had a chance at life. How, when she took the elixir, both her and her daughter became immortal. Chang'e becoming the moon goddess. This is The Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lynn Tan. And I am really hoping it has enough warrior women to fit this theme. Really, really hoping. Really hoping. We will see. We will see. But Qin Ying has spent her entire life on the moon. It's all she's ever known. It's always just been her mother, Chang'e, and their housekeeper, Ping'e. No one ever visits, and they never leave. Every evening, her mother obediently lights the lanterns that make the moon glow, and every morning she extinguishes them again. Her mother is loving and gentle, but there's always been a sadness to her. And occasionally, Qin Ying will see her mother standing on the balcony for hours, staring down wistfully at the mortal world. She's never given much thought to leaving the moon. She's happy in her quiet life. It's peaceful. She reads, she plays the flute and the jin, and spends her days wandering through the osmanthus forest outside their home. However, one day while sitting in her room daydreaming, Qin Ying is interrupted by her mother, stone-faced and worried. They have a visitor, the celestial empress, and she must not know of Qin Ying's existence. Surprised and curious by her mother's demand to stay hidden in her room until after the Empress leaves, Tinying decides that just one look at the mighty ruler would probably be okay. So she sneaks out of her room and listens in to her mother and the Empress's conversation. The Empress, while cordial, is cold and hard. But it is what the Empress says that has Tinying gasping for air. The Empress claims that her mother is a prisoner, imprisoned for stealing her husband's elixir of immortality. And while the Celestial Kingdom was lenient in their sentence, they could still punish her further for what she had done. After the Empress leaves, Chang'e comes to Tinying and tells her the truth about the elixir and how she made the decision to betray her husband Hou Yi and the Celestial Kingdom in order to save Tinying's life. But now the only way to save her is for her to leave. Ping-Er will take her to the Southern Sea to live with her family, and Tinying will get a fresh start, and the Celestial Kingdom will never know that she existed. So for the first time in her life, Tinying leaves the moon. However, the Celestial Kingdom is waiting, and as soon as she and Ping-Er leave, they are pursued. The only way, Tinying realizes, for Ping-Er to get away safely and for both of them to have a chance is for her to jump down to the ground and wait for a safe moment so Ping-Er can come back and get her. Ping-Er jumps, tumbles, and wakes the next morning, huddling on the cold ground. Ping-Er is nowhere in sight. She waits and she waits and she waits, but Ping-Er does not come back. Having no one and nowhere to go, she accepts the help of a woman passing by and finds herself at the Golden Lotus Mansion, where she secures herself a position as a lady's maid to the young mistress of the house, Lady Mei Ling. A demanding, spoiled girl, Mei Ling, along with her other maids, are constantly criticizing Tinying. The other maids often sabotage her work to try to get her in trouble and to try to get her dismissed. It is while she is trying to clean up the ink that another maid purposely spilt on one of Mei Ling's favorite robes, crying into the river at her misfortune and missing her mother and her home, that she meets Li Wei. He's a young man around her own age who surprisingly shows her kindness and comforts her. She finds herself opening up to him about her worries and her sorrows. And when she is surprised to find out that he is the crown prince of the Celestial Kingdom, she's not quite sure how to react. She learns that he was visiting the Golden Lotus Mansion in search of a companion to learn by his side. And acting bolder than she ever thought she could, Tinying asks that she too be considered an option for his companion. Shockingly, he agrees. And so a few days later, she finds herself moving into the Celestial Jade Palace, having won the coveted spot to learn and train by Prince Li Wei's side, and doing something her mother would never approve of, living alongside the people who must never learn she exists, the people who imprisoned her mother to life on the moon. She knows that she must never reveal her identity to anyone, but she also knows that maybe if she can learn alongside the prince, she'll be able to find a way to one day use that knowledge and her position to free her mother. So she starts her studies. And while the herbal and history lessons are quite boring, Tinying is excited to finally learn more about the magic that she never knew she had, and finds that she has quite an interest and an affinity for military tactics and fighting, especially with the bow, just like her father. As the years go by, Tinying and Li Wei grow closer as friends, training alongside each other. Now, while Li Wei has always been stronger with the sword and can wield his magic like it's second nature, Tinying easily surpasses his ability with the bow, one day being offered a place in the Emperor's prestigious army. Joining the army, however, would mean leaving Li Wei's side, the man that she has come to call her closest friend, and who she finds her feelings for are just growing stronger. Feelings which she is surprised to learn Li Wei returns. This is why, when at his birthday celebration, the Celestial Empress announces his betrothal to another, Tinying is beyond hurt and betrayed. And she realizes that through all the years she spent learning by Li Wei's side, she had lost sight of her own goals. The most important goal, freeing her mother. Hurt but recommitted to her task, Qin Ying finally accepts a position in the emperor's army. Under one condition. She doesn't care about position or rank or honors. She simply asks to be able to pick her own missions. For Qin Ying has a new plan. She is going to win the highest reward she can, the Crimson Lion Talisman. Gifted by the emperor himself, it grants the recipient one royal favor. Now, no one has ever received the talisman, not that anyone can really remember, not even Wen Zi, the army's youngest and most decorated captain. However, Qin Ying knows that if she can pick the best battles and the most eye-catching missions, then maybe she'll have a shot. And then maybe she'll be able to ask the Celestial Emperor himself to release her mother. This decision finds Qin Ying fighting in all manner of horrible battles. Against Yang Lu, the 9-headed murderous serpent who has been terrorizing the mortal realm, to the mind-controlling Governor Ren Yu, who is leading a rebellion against the Eastern Sea Kingdom, to the exiled flower goddess, Lady Hualing, who threatens Crown Prince Li Wei himself. With each battle, Qin Ying's skill with her bow and magic becomes stronger, and her talents and successes become more and more known throughout the immortal realms, eventually earning her the title of First Archer, a position which has never been given to anyone. However, as she completes more and more battles with no mention of the Crimson Lion Talisman, Qin Ying finds herself losing hope that she will ever be able to return to her mother and that she will ever be able to free her from the moon. This is a beautifully woven story. It's based on the Chinese legend of the Mid-Autumn Festival, which tells the tale of Hou Yi and Chang'e. Sue Lynn Tan has changed and adapted the original story to include Qin Ying and her part of the story. And there are so many nuances and storylines and characters that I haven't even begun to touch on in this summary. It is quite a bit of a longer book, as you can see. It does have some heft to it. And so there's so many different parts to the story and storylines and twists and things like that that I haven't even mentioned, that I think that Tan does a really good way of bringing it all together. And so it works really well and the story moves really smoothly. I picked this book after doing a Google search, trying to find a book for warrior women. Not as easy as you might think. We were talking about this before, is that I actually do read a lot of books with warrior women. It's a theme that I am drawn to. However, most of them I have already talked about or someone else has. And to actually go out and find a book with that theme to it is a little bit harder. But I picked this one, and it probably doesn't have as many warrior women in it that I thought it would. But it definitely has one very strong warrior woman who displays her warriorness throughout the book, and that is Qin Ying. And kind of a huge focus is on her ability with the bow and how she can fight with the bow and kind of use her magic in that as well. And so I think that does help to fit the category a bit more. Yeah, so it kind of focuses on her abilities to use her bow and arrow, as well as her mind to defeat her enemies. So she's a very smart fighter. She's a very smart woman. And so she can kind of use those quite well. I also realized that it is quite fitting that we're recording this on International Women's Day. I don't think we necessarily realized that. It just popped into my mind. So yay! A perfect topic for International Women's Day. I really enjoyed this book. I listened to it as an audiobook, which I actually really, really liked. I don't know if I would have been as drawn into it as I was if I had read it. I think that because there's so many different aspects to the story and to the narrative and so many different kind of adventures that they go on, I was able to be drawn in and swept into the story a bit more listening to it. I think you really feel for Qin Ying and really want her to succeed in everything that she does and get all of the wonderful things in her life that at times just kind of seems to be taken away from her. I truly applaud Sue Lynn Tan's use of twists in this book, because there was one especially that I did not see coming. I don't know if that's just because I didn't want to see it, but I did not see it coming. I'm a little bit mad that she created it this way, but I also think that it worked really well with the story. This book has romance, it has adventure, it has heartbreak, it has betrayal, it has ancient dragons and merfolk. It honestly ticked a lot of the boxes for me, and I think that it might for other people as well. So I really can't wait to read the sequel. It's a duology, and I'm really excited to read the second one. If you enjoy a beautifully told story that's steeped in legend, has a strong kick-ass heroine who, while also kicking ass, is also just trying to save her mother and figure out who she is as a person, then I think this would be a wonderful fit for you. This is The Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lynn Tan.
Thank you so much, Sadie. That sounds like it has just like really incredible world building in it, which is another one of the kind of things that I really love about books. Your description reminds me a lot of one of my favorite manga series called Yona of the Dawn, another kind of badass warrior woman who's really good at strategy and archery. So those kind of tie in well together. So thank you so much for that. I think we're moving on to Virginia. What warrior women do you have for us today?
All right. So last week when I asked you, Emma, to elaborate on the theme a little bit, you told me that you're not looking for some figuratively speaking warrior woman. You need them to fight at some point. So when I read the first couple paragraphs of this book, which include a line that says, one cannot reason with a snap string, and she's talking about her musical instrument at that point, nor can one chop it in half and be rid of the problem. When she stops to think on it, chopping things in half is part of why she's alone with this stupid instrument to start with. So that sounds promising when they're talking about chopping things in half right away. So I decided to go on and read The Tiger's Daughter by Arsenault Rivera for today's episode. And this is book 1 of the Ascendant trilogy. All the books are out, so you can binge read them if you so choose. And to be honest, I have not read a lot of fantasy lately, but picking one up is always like finding that old sweater that you thought you have lost, and then you put it on, you were like, oh yeah, how much it fits, how comfortable it is. And so that's kind of how I feel when I was picking this up and reading this book. So I think I picked the right book. The Tiger's Daughter is about Shizuka, born in the 8th hour of the 8th day of the 8th month. She's the niece to the emperor of the Hokuran Empire. She's the daughter of Shizuru, the best sword fighter in the whole wide world. And her mother is the champion of the emperor. And so Shizuka chooses to practice the sword. She just wants to duel everyone all day long. And that maybe one day she can even challenge her mother to a duel and get her to recognize her. Being born into a royal family, Shizuka never has a trace of fear. She's certain that everything will go her way. She's convinced even that she's not just a mere mortal, because it's weird that she has this ability to make things grow. Plants, flowers, they turn towards her when she walks by, and when she touches a tree, that something will bloom. And even if she just write the name of a plant down on the ground, in a few days, that plant will sprout. And of course, she believes that you can just chop everything in half with your sword if you have an issue with it. The Tiger's Daughter is also about Shefali. Born a month after Shizuka, she's the daughter of Bakila Ashara, her mother known as the Destroyer, the Terror of the Steppes, and now the leader of the Koran people because she murdered her brothers when they won't act and they won't do anything against the invaders. So she decides she's going to take power and just strike back at the Hokarans. Shefali was born under an open sky, which the Korans love above everything else. They don't see a point of having a permanent roof. They pick up the tents and they go wherever they want. And they treat their horses with the same respect that they treat people, maybe even a little bit more. Shefali's arrows never fail to hit their target. And she not just love her horse, but she might be able to even speak with them and understand them. But unlike Shizuka, she doesn't grow up thinking that everything will go her way. It's hard to do that when your mother, despite having the name of a destroyer, is the price that is paid for peace between the Hokuran Empire and her people. It's hard to be confident when you are looked down upon every single day, that you're told that you are inferior just because you're of your mixed blood and your darker skin. Shizuka and Shefali really have no reason to cross paths. One of them is a royal princess, the other one is just a commoner. But their mothers are the best of friends. They are comrades in arms. They were 2 of the 16 people sent to fight the demon generals. Only the 2 of them came back. They were imprisoned together for 8 days. and they came out swinging the head of a demon. Two of the fiercest women in the world. And in the book, they said people have rituals to try to avoid coming upon them. They have this inseparable bond. And The Tiger's Daughter is the story of their daughters forming that same bond and maybe even more. Yes, there's definitely chopping things in half, and those scenes are quite brutal, quite intense, and maybe not for the faint of heart. But really, The Tiger's Daughter is ultimately a relationship story. It is about the trials and tribulations of Shizuka and Shefali's relationship, starting out as kids, and even by the end of the first book, they're not even in their 20s yet. And it's their story about learning about their strengths, finding out who they are, and how they complement each other. And I remember Sadie talking about how generally you don't like the idea of soulmates. And there's definitely a little bit of that in the book. But I think it actually works because, I have no patience or time for romance in the books. And because they are already destined to be together, they don't have to go through all that stuff, right? So we skip all that part. And it's just about them building that bond and building on that relationship. And that's where the focus is. It's also interesting to see, even though they're destined together, it's interesting to see how they will have the more confident Shizuka against the quite, often quite doubtful Shefali about like sort of what's going on and about her own abilities. But having that tables turn a little bit throughout the book, the strong one doesn't always stay the same. And I think that mirrors sort of that story of colonization in the book, that's very complicated relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Started off with sort of an imbalance of position, of course, in power in the relationship and how it sort of changes throughout the book. And I think the intimacy of the story definitely is due to the framing device of the book, which is basically a series of very long letters. The book opens with the now Empress Shizuka receiving this kind of like a book that is written by Shefali, who's not there, and we don't know why they're not together at that point. But she's recounting their lives together. And so it's done in a second person, but it's not addressed to the reader. It's addressed to another character in this case. And it's about the stories of their adventures, their, chopping things in half together. And it's told through a very personal lens. And so that gives a really different flavor to a straightforward epic fantasy story, which I think is very appropriate for the book because, again, this is really a relationship story. And it really feels like you're just sitting around the fire listening to these legendary warrior women and what happened to them. And it's interesting to see that the author talk about how she read a lot of classics just before she wrote the book. So you can kind of feel that there's that sort of devices all used in this book. And at times it almost feels like you're almost like reading a classic just the way she writes. And I was quite surprised at the very dividing opinion about this book. It seems like you either love it or you hate it. And I think the people who hate it doesn't like the relationship. They find the book really, really slow. But as you can tell, I'm on the other side. I find like it's a really absorbing and immersive book. And I think there's times like I didn't realize the pages have gone by. Because this is like, again, like Sadie books, it's a pretty big book, but it just feels like the pages gone by so quickly. And there's times when I'm just like, didn't realize I'm crying when I'm crying about them. So I think that's a good sign of a book that really, the characters really speak to me a lot. And partly also because the books is so intense in many ways. And I don't like lukewarm things. So I love the intensity in the book in every way, whether it's the relationship, whether it's the fighting bits or the story itself. So I think that's why the book works for me. So if that sounds good to you, I would highly recommend you to check out The Tiger's Daughter, which is a book one in a trilogy. And again, all the books are out, so you can read them all now.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Definitely a book about warrior women. And you guys all know I love books about relationships between women who are very close to each other. I don't know if this is if in your book it's like a lesbian relationship or if it's just a platonic. Yeah. Okay, cool. We love lesbians. So happy International Women's Day. So that really sounds like a great book for the theme and a perfect book for me. So I should absolutely check that one out. All right, I will go next. And before I share a bit about my book that I have for us today, I just want to talk a little about kind of my love for warrior women and where that love comes from. It goes pretty far into my childhood. I did Taekwondo as a kid, so I was always kind of the only girl in my Taekwondo classes, the only girl like learning to fight this very masculine sport. And as a kid, I also really loved reading books where the girls were tough and oftentimes tougher than the boys, which is kind of how I felt in my Taekwondo classes. Also, one of my favorite TV shows As a child and into my adulthood, the cartoon Avatar: The Last Airbender, not the live action, the cartoon, introduced me to some really powerful and independent young women as role models, girls who faced a lot of adversity and who used their powers to fight for what they cared about. And a lot of the TV shows and the books that I continue to consume nowadays also feature women who are really strong fighters. Things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and a lot of my favorite shonen anime and manga like Bleach or Full Metal Alchemist or Jujutsu Kaisen. They all have casts that are filled with a lot of really strong women, oftentimes wielding giant swords. So we love that. And one of the things that I really love about these women is that they don't have to have masculine traits to be powerful or to be taken seriously. Like, I think to the book that Sadie talked about, it seems like the protagonist Sarah was quite feminine. And I mentioned before that it reminded me a lot of one of my favorite manga series, Yona of the Dawn, where Yona is a princess and she has an entourage of men with magical powers protecting her. But she decides that she kind of wants to take her destiny into her own hands and learns archery so she can protect herself and be a warrior herself. And I really love that. So the book that I chose for the pod today is a little bit outside of my typical reading habits. It's a historical fiction and it's very, very plot driven with a lot of kind of high stakes adventure and action and little internal character development or exposition. So pretty different from what Virginia talked about. My book is pretty much like all action, no vibes. Or all vibes. I can't really tell, but there's not a lot of character development going on. It's kind of just this happened, then this happened, then this happened, which isn't usually what I read. But if you're drawn to those kind of action-packed, like really quick moving plot-focused stories, then this could be a good choice for you. It's the kind of book where you're immediately thrown into the middle of the action without much exposition or much explanation of what's really going on. So, despite it being outside my usual choices, the content is still very Emma. There's a lot of warrior women, a lot of badassery going on. It's about a gender bending, bisexual, and extremely hardcore protagonist who carries a pistol and isn't afraid to stab a man. So, that's kind of where we're starting here. She's sort of like a Western cowboy detective gunslinger type. And despite the fact that she makes quite a few problematic choices throughout the book, you can't help but root for her because she's still quite likable. So the book that I read today is called The Best Bad Things by Katrina Carrasco. So as the book begins, readers are immediately dropped into the thick of the action. It's 1887, and Alma Rosales is on the hunt for stolen opium. She's just arrived in Port Townsend, Washington Territory from San Francisco, where her mission is to infiltrate a local trade organization, earn the trust of the boss and his boys, find the turncoat who stole the missing opium, all while preventing them from uncovering her own secrets. As an expert in disguise and a professional trained in espionage by Pinkerton's detective agency, she doesn't think this mission will be too difficult. Except she was expelled from her spy training for bad behavior, and on top of that, has a penchant for going undercover as a man, which oftentimes gets her in more trouble. Since her expulsion, Alma now works for Delphine Beaumont, a seductive mastermind running the West Coast smuggling ring, and also Alma's former lover from her San Francisco days. When the product goes missing at Delphine's Port Townsend outpost, she tasks Alma with tracking the thief and recovering the stolen drugs. So Alma goes undercover as Jack Camp, a scrappy young dock worker who's new in town and doesn't have any allegiance or much of a reputation yet. And as Jack, Alma is able to muscle her way into the local trade organization run by Nathaniel Wheeler, a magnetic Scotsman who has his own personal history with Alma. The two met in Scotland years before, where Alma was posing as a governess, and she nearly seduced Wheeler in the back of a carriage. So Wheeler's not happy to see Alma again, especially when he realizes who she really is, and that she's trying to deceive him by dressing as a man. When she proves her worth to him as an informant and as a muscle man, Wheeler reluctantly lets Alma in on his trade operation. He's her prime suspect as the thief of Delphine's opium, and so getting closer to Wheeler and his associates allows her to get closer to finding her culprit. Throughout the whole book, Alma is playing double, sometimes triple agent. You never really know where her true allegiances are. And while she's trying to win Wheeler's trust, and she's also reporting her progress on her mission to Delphine, she's simultaneously sending dispatches to Pinkerton agents, the detective agency that she was expelled from, who are ready to close in on the entire smuggling operation happening in Port Townsend. So, with one wrong step, Alma's entire mission could fall apart. Her mission to get closer to Wheeler, to help Delphine find her thief, and to inform Pinkerton of illegal trade activity. Any misstep puts her in danger of her true identity being discovered as a woman, as a traitor, and as a spy. So most of the plot of this book is just Alma kind of swaggering around Fort Townsend, moving from one backroom meeting to another, having clandestine hookups with both men and women that she encounters on her search for Delphine's missing product. She interviews and intimidates suspects, threatening them with violence more often, and also getting attacked herself for having a very sharp tongue and quite a snarky attitude. In nearly every chapter, Alma gets stabbed or shot at or wrestled to the ground by another one of Port Townsend's dock workers or smugglers. So if you don't like a lot of violence in your books, this one is probably not for you because it can be quite bloody. And she also has a lot of sexual tension with nearly all of the women that she meets and most of the men as well. Another aspect of Alma's character that can get her in considerable amounts of trouble. As the search for the stolen opium comes to a head, there are more backstabbings and double crosses than I could personally keep count of. But the story has a satisfying twist at the end and a killer final line that kept me reading, despite how confusing it could get at times to keep track of all of the different characters and all of their kind of changing and twisting allegiances. I would say this book is a masterpiece of ambiance and atmosphere, but despite it being entirely driven by its dramatic plotline, the plot itself was pretty repetitive. Alma meets with a suspect in a back room. She's intimidated. She meets an attractive lady that keeps her attention for a while. Someone is stabbed, someone is murdered. And the book kind of keeps up with this pattern pretty much the entire way through. I'd say you could probably cut it in half, cut about half of those plot points out, and you would still have the same story if you kept the beginning and the end. My partner recommended this book to me, and as I was finishing my notes for the pod today, I told her that I didn't really know what else to say about the plot. And her response was she didn't think the book knew what it was saying about the plot either, which I think kind of encapsulates the vibe of what this book is about perfectly. Overall, The Best Bad Things is a vivid and exciting, fast-paced historical crime novel. It does a really good job of imagining the Pacific Northwest port towns in the 1880s. You're immediately thrown into the action from the get-go, and the author does a really great job of scene setting and of really capturing the essence of that port town as a haven for smugglers. However, despite that really strong scene setting, the book lacks any sort of exposition, as I said earlier, which can make the plot and the characters a little bit difficult to follow. Sometimes the characters in the book feel a little two-dimensional. It seems like the author favored focusing on a high-stakes, action-packed plot over dwelling on the characters' internal feelings or motivations. You don't really get any insight into what these characters are thinking the entire time. It's all action, it's all dialogue. And there are also so many characters that they just keep introducing without giving you any sort of background on them. So it can be difficult to keep track of everybody, especially with the sheer number of double crosses and backstabbings. It's hard to keep track of who everyone's allegiances are with and who's betrayed who. So despite what feels like an overstuffed plot and cast of characters at times, the book is still very engaging and exciting to read. It reads very quickly. It's a really quick page turner. And I definitely recommend it to people who are looking for a fast-paced, high-stakes Western or crime thriller. Like I said before, there is a lot of violence in this. So if it's not your thing, you probably wouldn't enjoy it. But if you do like violence, if you're okay with a little bit of violence in your books, if you like violence, no, I'm kidding. If you're okay with a little violence in your books, then you might wanna check this one out. Alma's a protagonist that's really fascinating to follow. We don't get much of her internal monologue, as I said before, but so it's kind of difficult to see what her motivations are beyond just her desire to fulfill her mission and to get back into Delphine's bed. But her actions and choices stay consistent throughout the whole book. She's violent, she's rash, she's arrogant, and morally corrupt, which I feel are character traits that are rare for a female protagonist. So it was kind of cool to see her act like that. And that's something that I think could appeal to readers, especially people who like really complex and complicated characters. She also sleeps with a lot of people, both men and women, throughout the course of the book. Despite not agreeing with many of her choices, the bisexual chaos of it all made it a very fun ride. I personally really love an antihero with questionable morals, which I think is to be expected given what you guys know about my reading tastes. So I really enjoyed following Alma on this adventure. So if you enjoy historical fiction or crime thrillers, westerns, chaotic bisexuals, or tough as nails, gunslinging, gender-bending ladies, then you should read The Best Bad Things by Katrina Carrasco. Alrighty, I think it's time that we can shift to our existential question for today. So, given the theme being warrior women, I want to ask my book friends, what is your weapon of choice?
These days, it just feels like it's a day to like slash things and chop things. So I'm going to go with, and especially because Final Fantasy just came out, I'm going to go with Cloud's Buster Sword because it's giant. And that's really all that is. It's just a big, giant sword.
We love a big sword.
There you go.
Sadie, what about you?
See, I want to say magic because magic is awesome, but I find bows and arrows absolutely fascinating. And I've always really, really wanted to learn how to use one. I did like a very small amount of archery when I think it was my 6th grade school trip where we stayed at a summer camp and rode horses and learned how to shoot bows and arrows. And yeah, I was terrible at it, but I wanted to do more of it. So I think I will say the bow and magic, which is surprisingly or not surprisingly, the exact weapons that my protagonist in the book that I read today also favors. But yeah, I mean, I've always wanted magic. I've always wanted to be able to use magic and fireballs and all of that kind of fun stuff.
Can I ask what type of magic would be your specialty?
Ooh, I think of anything. I mean, like anything where you can like create a weapon out of nothing, I think. So like maybe illusion. Could that be like an illusion kind of thing where I could turn something into something else or make something look like it is a weapon? And yeah, I'm going to go with that. Confidently go with that.
For me personally, I also think I would use a bow and arrow for long range attacking. When I play video games and RPGs, that's typically what I like to do is bow and arrows. But I also think that like dual stilettos, those kind of like long stabbing knives, I think that would be so cool. I love any kind of double weapon, like dual swords, dual stilettos, something like that would be really fun for like a melee attack. What do you think, Corinne?
The double like stiletto daggers is just undeniably cool. It's always a great look. It just always looks so cool and so smooth. If I'm going to be super honest, like fighting just seems like exercise and work. So honestly, my weapon of choice would probably be poison. Low effort, maximum impact. And you don't have to break a sweat when you're doing it.
I'm not surprised at all. That's the perfect Corinne answer. Awesome. And on that note, I think it's your turn, Corinne. What warrior woman do you have for us today?
As I said, talking to Sadie when we were getting ready for this podcast, is not every woman a warrior for just making it through the day? And that is not my justification to try and cheat my way through this episode, because I really honestly and earnestly did do a little Google search to try and see if I could find like books with warrior women and failed. So I decided to go kind of like the actual historical warrior woman route and kind of go back to a book that is about a warrior woman that I really enjoyed and thought was pretty fascinating, because I love a nonfiction, and sometimes I just feel like we don't get enough nonfiction here. So one of the most successful and long-lasting anti-Nazi spy network called themselves the Alliance, but they were nicknamed by the Gestapo as Noah's Ark. And this was because all of the members called themselves by animal names. So the eagle, the lion, the bull, rather than referring to themselves by their own names. Members of this French resistance cell spied, they ferried down Allied pilots over the dangerous route through the Pyrenees back to England. They did surveillance and sabotage. And this group, the Alliance, were instrumental in D-Day, in that their agents provided the Allies with a 55-foot-long map of the beaches and roads that the Allies would land on in D-Day, including notations of every German gun and fortification. After World War II was over, General Charles de Gaulle designated 1,038 people as resistance heroes. This came with honor, it came with a pension, and it came with recognition of what they had done through the war. But there were some notable oversights from that list, including the leader of Noah's Ark, leader of the Alliance, called the Hedgehog. Now, they had chosen this nickname of the small, unassuming animal because, as I said, it's a tough little animal that even a lion would hesitate to bite. This cute little garden dweller seems unassuming, but when challenged, is dangerous. For playing such a key role in the liberation of France, this does seem like a massive oversight. But those who knew the hedgehog suspected why. Of the over 1,000 heroes on de Gaulle's list, only 6 of these were women, despite there being many women who worked as resistance spies, radio operators, couriers, many of whom lost their lives. And this list is just exemplary of the sexism that the hedgehog fought against her entire life. Mary Madeleine Fourcade was born into a fairly easy life. Her father was part of the French Marines, and she grew up in Shanghai, went to a convent school, and was recognized as clever and cunning. Her sharpness caught the eye of Major General George Lestano-Lecaux, who recruited her in the 1930s in the face of growing fascism. Her life seemed destined to be average. She was a young French woman coming from a certain background. She was married to, as far as I can tell from the book, some guy, and had 2 children. But her entire life changed when the Nazis marched into Paris in June of 1940. Madame Fourcade leapt into the action when her government, led by Pétain, capitulated, establishing the collaborative Vichy France. Disgusted, Mary Madeleine was not going to stand by and just let this happen in her own backyard. She joined the alliance, but when Major George Lestano-Lecaux was captured by the Gestapo, he named her, 31 years old, a woman with 2 children, as the head of the alliance, keeping watch over a network of thousands of spies. This was an extremely dangerous job, which included her having to change locations every 3 weeks as they were ruthlessly pursued by the Gestapo, who executed hundreds of her spies, including friends and her lover. She had to constantly change her name, constantly changed her identity, her hair color, her personality, kind of discarding her 2 children wherever she could put them. And she was actually captured twice by the Gestapo, managing to escape once by sneaking out naked through the bars of her cell. She was the only female chef de résistance, but she is part of a larger group of warrior women of World War II who were largely ignored or shuffled off after the war was over and the patriarchy came raging back, including Virginia Hall, the SOE agent who was named by the Gestapo as the most dangerous of all Allied spies, who led a spy network of surveillance despite having a prosthetic leg. After the war withered away at a desk at the CIA, largely forgotten, largely ignored, despite her massive potential. This book is a biography, but also delves into the stories, both triumphant and tragic, of other female agents working in France during World War II. It also touches on the larger political issues and sexism that agents and resistance officers faced during the war. Fourcade managed to survive, but was largely ignored by her government, but spent most of her time petitioning for better conditions for her former agents. Lynne Olsen, who is a historian, writes an illuminating history of a true warrior in an inspiring and frankly amazing story in Madame Fourcade's Secret War. If you enjoyed books like The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna and wanted to kind of learn more about the experiences of women agents during World War II, or if you've read the kind of glut of World War II ladies fiction and want to know a little bit more about the history and the real stories behind them, I heartily recommend kind of delving into this book and gaining a deeper understanding of what resistance fighting really looked like and the struggles of these women both during the war and after the war. Mary Madeleine was an inspiring warrior woman, and I hope, Emma, you will forgive me for kind of bending the topic a little.
I wouldn't say you bent the topic at all. I was actually going to say I'm really glad that you brought a nonfiction. I like to read nonfiction. I don't do it as often as I read fiction, but I was a little bit worried. No, I wouldn't say worried, but like I thought maybe everyone would read a fantasy and we just get like a bunch of different fantasy warrior women over and over again, which would be great. But it's nice that we have some diversity to it. Like we have a gunslinging Western, we've got two good fantasy stories, we've got an archer, we've got a swordswoman, and then we've got like an actual woman who actually existed, who was very much a badass and very much a warrior and kind of managed a network of a bunch of different warrior women. So I really appreciate that you brought something kind of different to the table. And I definitely think it still fits the theme. So thank you all for the wonderful book recommendations that you brought today. I did not realize today was International Women's Day, but happy International Women's Day. We're celebrating by uplifting voices of awesome warrior women. Hopefully, our listeners are able to get a couple of good book recommendations out of this. So thank you all for the books that you brought today, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.